I am Dave, the Amateur Magus. On this channel, I talk all about the mechanics behind ceremonial magic, occultism, esotericism, and the mechanics behind everything you can find within a dusty old grimoire. On this episode, we will be talking all about the mechanics behind binding, magical bindings, that kind of thing. So, if you enjoy my content, feel free to share it around, subscribe, and if you really enjoy my content, please subscribe to me over on Patreon. Also got a Discord. The link is on the Patreon. It's the pinned link on the Patreon. And once again, if you are watching this over on Patreon, you have my thanks for your continued support. Let's get into it. So, binding spells are something that is listed in Agrippa. And I did a live stream on Agrippa. And I mentioned on that stream, well, at the beginning of the stream, my streams go all over the place. So at the beginning of the stream, I talked about Agrippa, and I mentioned that Agrippa does kind of go all over the place quality-wise. Sometimes you are reading the absolute genius occult take of the century, possibly even for all time, really. And then, on the other hand, sometimes you get to delve into and plumb the depths of madness that is medieval science. But towards the end, he does talk about some mechanics that occultists actually do use. One of which I want to talk about, and I want to expand into an entire video, and that being binding spells. Binding spells are one of the most useful mechanisms that you can use in a spell. Don't believe me? Well, if you have written a good statement of intent, it should end with something to the effect of, with no harm done. That is a binding. You are using that to bind harm from manifesting as part of the spell. Now, that being said, is that the only use of a binding? No, absolutely not. There are plenty of times where you can use mechanical... you can use different occult mechanisms to bind things to you or bind things from happening to you. So, think of it like this. If you're binding something to you, you are binding it into being a thing that is manifesting. If you are binding something away from you, you are binding it towards not happening in your life. Agrippa, quoting Agrippa, paraphrasing him at least, mentions that there are binding spells to bind people from, there are binding spells to bind from harm, there's binding spells to bind to harm, and there's spells that are so powerful they can bind storms and keep them from destroying ships. Okay? Because that was the kind of thing that they needed to worry about. Now, nowadays we don't really need to worry about storms as much. In the modern era, he says, basically living in a torrential rainstorm for the past summer. So if it wasn't obvious, binding spells have a lot of use cases, and those use cases are going to inevitably crop up at some point. So I want to cover them a little bit here, and we can cover them and talk about them so that everyone knows what the proper use cases are. Now, the first use case is going to be binding actions not wanted. This is going to be at the end of your statements of intent. If you've ever done this, you've done some kind of magical binding. Congratulations to you. However, that is not the only form of binding actions not wanted. So, for example, you can use a candle spell or use some thread. Usually thread is used in binding spells just due to the fact that if you tie something up, it adds a level of synchronicity to the candle spell. Now, that being said, what you're going to be able to do is you're going to want to use binding spells to bind anything you might not want. So if you don't want, if you want to bind money to you, that would be a form of money spell, but you're binding money towards coming to you, or at least not leaving you as fast as it comes. You're binding yourself to increase in wealth, as it were. Likewise, if you're binding other things, you want to bind negative things away, and you want to bind positive things to you. Effectively, what you're doing here is you're using the powers of... Actually, you're using the powers of Saturn the powers of Saturn and the binding powers in general in order to bind out negative influences out of your life and to bind in positive influences. Pro good things, anti bad things. So you're going to want to use this in order to bind things that you can probably see coming, but they're kind of a negative issue. So if you see something good on the horizon, you want to bind that into happening, and if you see negative things happening, you want to bind those. This is what Agrippa means when he says that they bound storms in his section on binding spells. Another important thing to know about binding spells is that there is such a spell classification as a love binding, which is used primarily on places like TikTok and Twitter. That being said, I don't recommend doing love bindings because love bindings are usually, like, by far the worst kind of binding spell you can get, because worst case scenario, the love spell doesn't work out, you end up attracting a partner who is not really compatible with you, and then they are bound to you, and you just kind of have to deal with that, and they're just kind of like always creeping back up into your thoughts and into your mind and into your life even. So yeah, don't do love bindings. That being said, things you should be binding. You should be binding from any kind of issues caused by, like, financial crises. You should protect yourself from those. You should think of binding spells as you are using them to guarantee a manifestation, or alternatively, you are using the binding spell in order to protect yourself from an event. So a good example is if you think you're about to get laid off from your job, you can do a binding spell to bind yourself from getting laid off or otherwise fired from your job if you really enjoy your job. That being said, you can also, likewise, bind yourself into a promotion. There is a give and take here, and binding spells can be used for good and bad. A notable example of what you can do with binding spells is you can bind yourself into certain behaviors. So if you want to lose weight but you don't want to work out, what you can do is you can forcibly bind yourself into working out, and you can you can make it so that you just have a home exercise routine, like bind yourself into that, and you can just do that. That's a really simple method of binding because you're binding, one, yourself, into a thing that you already want to do, but you don't have the motivation. So binding yourself and doing it gives you the motivation because you are, motivated to do it because you are forced, to do it. So you're kind of magically forcing yourself in a weird cosmic sense in and of itself. There's also, of course, the binding of spirits. This is going to be most notably the binding of the demons from the Ars Goetia. There is also the binding of spirits that is done through the Abramelin ritual, and you're binding your Holy Guardian Angel to you as part of that ritual in the obtaining the knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel, so your angel doesn't leave you, which is kind of the entire point of that. It's to bind the angel and get the angel to, help you with all the things that you might need help doing, such as binding demons. The limits of binding spells should be self-evident, but let's talk a little bit about that. Things you cannot bind. You cannot usually bind things from happening that are already happening. So if you're in the middle of a storm, you can't bind yourself from being, free of storms on your journey if you are already in a storm. That's not how that works. Now, you can bind a storm from harming you during your journey if you're already mid-storm, but that is different from you can't stop something that's already occurred. That is the biggest downside of binding spells. You cannot banish something, because binding spells are keeping something contained in a sense. In a sense, you're keeping something from, you're keeping something from happening. Whether that be you're binding yourself from loss, or you're binding yourself to gain, which is preventing loss. That being said, that's really all I got to talk about binding spells. Do magic responsibly. Don't use what I have to say here for nefarious purposes. That is just a terrible thing, and you will get the spiritual cops on you. So, I have been Dave, the Amateur Magus. Once again, if you enjoyed this content, feel free to share it around where you think it would be enjoyed. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, and if you really enjoy my content, please consider supporting me on Patreon. And if you're watching this on Patreon, as I put all the YouTube-specific videos up pretty much a month in advance on Patreon, for the people who are subscribed and watching this on Patreon, you have my thanks for your continued and ongoing support. So, I have been Dave, the Amateur Magus. Hope you are having a good day. If you're not having a good day, hope your day gets better. Take it easy.